I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Senator Dick Durbin denounced, quote, violent white supremacism during a Senate Democratic press briefing on Tuesday. His remarks come after 10 people were killed in a racially motivated shooting in Buffalo earlier this month. He voiced his support of the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which would ensure that the Justice Department, FBI, and Homeland Security would work together to combat these threats. Durbin concluded that Abe Lincoln, the first Republican president, would not recognize the current GOP today. Here's more from the Illinois Democrat.
Thanks, Chuck. The mass shooting in Buffalo just a few weeks ago was a tragic reminder of the ongoing and persistent threat posed by violent white supremacism and other far-right extremism. I first held a hearing on this subject 10 years ago, in 2012, after the massacre by a white supremacist at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. In March of last year, the first official hearing of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which I chaired, the first official hearing was with the Capitol FBI Director Christopher Wray. He testified to the Judiciary Committee about the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and that the threat of domestic terrorism, in the words of FBI Director Wray, was, quote, metastasizing, close quote, throughout the country. The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act responds to this threat. It would ensure the Department of Justice, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security work together to track and respond to this threat. It would establish offices to combat domestic terrorism at these departments, and it would require these offices to regularly assess domestic terrorism threats in the United States and to focus on the most significant threat. Crucially, these agencies would also provide training and resources to assist state, local, and tribal law enforcement in addressing the threat of domestic terrorism. This bill would also establish an interagency task force to combat white supremacist infiltration of the uniformed services and federal and state and local law enforcement ranks. In the last Congress, the House passed this Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act by a voice vote. However, the House Republican leadership chose to whip against the bill last week, leading to a largely party-line vote on this issue. Even the House Republican co-sponsors of the bill, who joined me in a press conference last year to introduce the bill, voted against their own bill. In order to justify the change of position, some Republicans are falsely claiming the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act would lead to spying on American citizens. One even claimed it was the Patriot Act of American citizens. Think of that for a moment. The director of the FBI tells us domestic terrorism is metastasizing like a cancer across the United States. He points out white supremacists, white nationalists as an example of this extremism. We put in a bill to monitor the investigations and prosecution of domestic terrorism, and the Republicans oppose it. Can you imagine this? Can you imagine how they would scream that Democrats were soft on terrorism, and yet they're doing exactly the same things themselves? It is hard to believe, as Chuck has mentioned, the first president of the Republican Party was Abraham Lincoln from our state of Illinois. He wouldn't recognize the Republicans of today, and he certainly wouldn't recognize the MAGA Republicans and their warped values. It is false to claim this is a Patriot Act. The people who are engaged in terrorism across this country are not patriots and never should be characterized as such. The reality is this bill is just the same one that passed the House in 2019 with very few changes, and it does not provide any new law enforcement authority, creates no new crimes. In fact, this act is a modest bill that simply ensures that we collect the data. I'll make one last point. Why are we making this distinction to collect data on domestic terrorism if it involves white supremacy? Because under the Trump administration, they eliminated the category at the FBI. They didn't want the information coming forward because they knew the reality of the people who descended on this building on January 6th of last year. They knew the reality of the white supremacists that we're seeing manifest their hate in Buffalo, New York, and so many other places. This bill will help keep America safe. How many more cities must face the tragedy and pain of Oak Creek, Wisconsin, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, California, El Paso, Buffalo. I hope that these communities and all communities across this nation will join us in a domestic effort to stop terrorism in the United States. Let's be honest about who the terrorists are, and let's make sure that they don't harm another American family.